Hello and welcome to another edition of Executive Corner Expert Talks. With a range of restrictions lifting across New South Wales today, cinema chains will be finally able to reopen. Alongside live music, cinema chains have been particularly hard hit by government-enforced lockdowns. One of those chains is Majestic Cinemas, and joining me now is the CEO of Majestic Cinemas, Kieren Dell, to give us an insight about the past 2 years of challenges and hopefully a very bright future moving forward. Kieren, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, James.
Kieren, great to have you here today. It must be somewhat of an exciting day for you. I know where your base is primarily in regional locations, which haven't had the same restrictions that Sydney have. But for those who aren't familiar, first and foremost, with Majestic Cinemas, tell us a little bit about the company. How many locations do you have and how many screens in total?
We were founded about 19 years ago in Nambucca Heads up in northern New South Wales. But we now have 8 sites that range from the Hunter Valley through to the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Most of those are in regional areas, but we do have a site now in Brisbane in a metro area as well. We've got 8 sites, about 29 screens altogether.
Well, plenty of places to grab a bit of a popcorn, a choc top and enjoy all the big movies, that's for sure. Now, what would you say separates you from some of those big chains like Event Cinemas and Reading Cinemas?
I think starting in a regional area, we find ourselves much more connected to our communities. So whether that's running lots of fundraisers that we are often doing, right through to the fact that we program differently for all of our sites depending on the local community. So some places like Sawtell near Coffs Harbour, the cinema there has more of an art house feel, and so they get a lot more art house movies. And others like Singleton in the mining area, that like their big blockbusters. So each cinema is programmed differently, not just a sort of cookie cutter approach, if you like.
Now, in terms of that notion as well, let's say take one of your sites in Port Macquarie. I know there's a big surf culture there as well. So is that something you feed into as well, of the general vibe of the location?
Yeah, we often run particular types of movies for areas. The surf films, for example, are pretty popular in places like Port Macquarie and Sawtell that are on surf beaches. We run lots of adventure films, and certain sites like adventure films, right through to the other end of the spectrum where some of them enjoy opera or art films. So not all of our sites will appreciate that, so we'll have different programming depending on where it is. But yeah, we have a whole lot of alternate content, as we call it, which is not your mainstream movies, but it's more specialist content, if you like.
I love it. Sounds very much specially curated for each individual market. Now, Kieren, obviously the past 2 years has been quite brutal on a lot of people, especially those, for example, in Victoria. I know you don't have places down there for Majestic Cinemas, but you yourself, with what you're doing in terms of having a cinema chain, there's been some really tough restrictions placed on the business and how it can function. Can you take me through what those past 2 years have looked like for you?
Yeah, well, 2 years is a good time frame because 18 months has been COVID. But before that, of course, we had significant bushfires, which were 2 years ago now, October, November 2 years ago. And that knocked out some of our cinemas from operating. It also stopped people from attending, and obviously people were worried about the bushfires. It actually delayed us opening a new cinema in Kempsey because all of the people who had to finish off the building were actually out there fighting fires at the time. So we were delayed about a month in opening a new cinema. So the bushfires were what started it 2 years ago. Obviously we had COVID hit in last year in March, but this year we also had floods. And the floods also closed some of our cinemas and caused various issues. So we've had all sorts of natural disasters. COVID itself, we were shut down from mid-March last year for a bit over 3 months completely, and we were completely reliant on government support to get through, as well as our landlords, who have mostly been fantastic in providing us with assistance, and our bank, who've also been very good. So without those 3 parties providing us with assistance, we wouldn't have survived. We were shut down completely for a bit over 3 months, but even when we opened up, we had restrictions. I think we were at 1 per 4 square metre, which is about a third of our normal capacity. We didn't have many movies, and we were running at sometimes less than 10% of normal in terms of our revenue. So it took quite some time to get back. That was sort of July last year when we reopened. Over some of the period where we've had some big movies, and the biggest issue for cinemas has been that even though we might have been open in Australia, they weren't necessarily open overseas. And so if they weren't open overseas, the big film studios weren't going to release big movies like Top Gun Maverick or James Bond, which have been delayed multiple times. So we didn't have much content for people to see, and so some of the things we were showing were not necessarily things we would normally show on a cinema screen. So we've had to navigate through probably at about 40% on average of our normal over the last year and a half through COVID. But we've had times with holiday periods like at Christmas and so on with some big movies, particularly some great Australian movies last Christmas, like The Dry, that we could operate at up to 2/3 of normal capacity. But we're still struggling to get back to that full business, if you like.
What's been the impact on staff? Because I know you've mentioned you had, the support of landlords and banks and also government grants, but did you find you had to scale back a fair bit in terms of people you're employing?
Yeah, in March last year when we closed, we stood everyone down. We had 140 staff. A lot of those staff were casuals, might be school kids, uni students, but a good core of about 40 senior staff across our 8 sites. And we had to stand everyone down, myself included, and everyone had to initially apply for Centrelink benefits, and of course JobKeeper came along, and that made life much easier. But that could only apply to our 40 senior staff. So the other 100 kids, I had one day there where I had to basically terminate the employment of 100 people in one day on bulk, and that's not a fun thing to have to do because we just couldn't afford to pay JobKeeper to 140 people. And about 90 people might have qualified, but some of these young kids were 16, 17, and it didn't make sense. So we had to terminate all of those staff. We've been pretty lucky, and hopefully it's not just luck, but most of our senior staff have stayed with us through the whole period, and they've stuck it out. It's been really hard mentally for them, actually in some cases, but with JobKeeper and now the various other programs that are in place through Centrelink, everyone's been able to manage and get through financially. It's more the mental side, and so this second set of lockdowns this year have actually been a lot harder on our staff than last year because there was less certainty about when we were going to perhaps come to an end, how it was going to end. We're now dealing with issues of how we check people's vaccine status, and so this second lockdown this year, and we haven't had JobKeeper, we've had different levels of support which have been a bit more clunky from government, and so it's been a bit more uncertain and changing quite rapidly, and so the mental health of our staff has been foremost. So, but we are, our staff have come through this really well, both financially and hopefully mentally, and are looking forward to getting busy again.
Well, let's focus on the financials now for just a moment. Obviously, it's been a very tough 2-year period, but I just want to take you to the start of COVID back in March last year. Were you experiencing a lot of fantastic growth with the business up until that? And do you find that COVID hitting really sort of hammered that on the head? Is that what occurred for you?
Our business is a funny one because it very much relies on the quality of the movies that we have over a period of time. And so Hollywood, probably the previous financial year before the bushfires and everything, it had a pretty average year, I'd have to say. And we get that about one every 3 years. But we were hitting our straps that financial year when COVID hit. We had a great program set up, and we certainly felt that the business was growing. Personally, we were building a new site in Brisbane at the time. We were just about to launch a site in Kempsey that had been built, and we had about 2 or 3 other sites in Queensland that we were working on. So, from a growth point of view, in terms of the business, those sites we basically had to walk away from. We hadn't quite signed the deals, and so it did stymie the growth in our business. The movie business itself, it goes up and down, but generally does go up over time. And we were looking forward to a big year last year. What's happened though is a lot of those movies didn't get released. Some were given to streaming platforms and so on, but most of them have been delayed. And so we're now seeing those movies that we would have showed last year showing over this year, and we would expect that to return the industry to growth. Probably from Christmas onwards.
Well, you made mention there of streaming platforms and how they've received a bunch of the content that would usually be finding its way into the cinemas itself. How has the impact of streaming affected cinema chains more broadly, do you think?
It's not quite what people think. If I had $1 for every time someone asked that question, I'd be very rich. People ask me, hasn't streaming killed cinemas? and it hasn't. In fact, the opposite. What all the research shows is that the more people stream content, the more they're consumers of content, the more they will actually go to the cinema. But the difference is twofold. One is that people want to see certain content at the cinema, so they don't necessarily want to see the medium-sized movies. Let's call them the B-graders, the little thrillers, that sort of thing, the romantic comedies even. They want to see the big blockbusters. And then we have an older audience and a family audience that want to see perhaps smaller kids' movies like a Paw Patrol, which is not, which is big on TV, but will come to the cinema at various times. Or the older customers who want to see some of those smaller movies. So you've seen the big blockbusters, the small movies, some of the family movies focus on cinema, but those medium-sized sort of second-tier films have gone a lot to streaming. So what that's meant is that the studios, to keep the supply of movies going, are making more and more blockbusters than they ever did. So something that has that big screen impact, and you need the big sound. The other impact of streaming, I suppose, is we've all got used to getting things on demand. When we click a button, we can watch it now. And so as cinemas, of course, it doesn't work quite like that. The cinema session times are set. But what we're moving towards, as we're building new cinemas and even refurbishing older ones, is we're building more screens and smaller screens. So that when Tenet came out, for example, in August, which is the one big blockbuster we had last year in that period, I know at Port Macquarie we were running it on the hour every hour in 3 different cinemas. And so it's about convenience for people, and streaming has taught people to want convenience. So we find that we've got to have more screens that are perhaps smaller that people the convenience of times. But streaming itself can coexist and will coexist with cinema quite easily. Where it's been challenging over the last year is what's called the window between something being released in the cinema and something being released at home, whether it's on more likely a streaming service of some sort these days. And often there's a cost to that in the home initially as well. That's come under some pressure during the pandemic. Some of the studios have experimented, shall we say, with putting things on streaming at the same time as cinemas. Some of them, just to get some money in, we were all looking for revenue in that period, sold some of their movies to streamers. Remember, the streamers are also reliant on getting a steady supply from cinema of product. So Disney Plus, for example, is used to getting a cinema release from Disney and then getting onto the Disney Plus channel platform. But they didn't have that because the things weren't being released in cinemas. So some things went straight to streaming last year, but that was a bit of an aberration. And so what's happened since is that all of the major studios, whether it be Disney, Universal, Warner Brothers, etc., that produce most of the movies that we show, they've all now talked about having what's called a 45-day window between something being released in the cinema and something being released at home. Now, previously that was about 90 days, but it was coming down and was destined to come down. And what COVID's done is moved that forward. But that's largely where we've settled. So things will go back to some sort of normal as cinemas are now sort of opening up all around the world. But streaming per se hasn't changed it. But the fact is, people aren't going to wait 3 months to get something at home now. 45 days is about right. But most of the money in cinemas for the studios is made in the first 3 weeks of release. So everything's very front-loaded these days. And also, back in the 1960s, a movie like Sound of Music would have run for 6 months at a cinema. Now we run movies for 3 to 4 weeks, and then there's the next one comes along. And because all those blockbusters are being made, we've got some new content every week, week on week. So after 45 days, it'll go to streaming services, and that works pretty well for both parties. And what the studios have found financially is that if they don't have a cinema release, the view of the movie over its life is much less, and they don't get the second or third bite of the cherry. Movies are very different to most products because the same movie is sold multiple times in the cinema, to in terms of a pay-per-view, then into streaming services, and then on to free-to-air TV perhaps. So they get multiple bites of the cherry. And by combining the first 2 parts of that, they actually lose that extra bite of the cherry. So the studios have realised financially that they need to release it in cinemas. It gives it a bit of kudos, and it gets the value of the movie up. But the period before which they release it to the home has shortened and sort of settled in that month and a half type time frame.
And I think you're right as well, Kieren. It's not just the fact that it's the ability to see it first before it does come to one of those platforms. It's still the whole sense of the event and the occasion about getting out with the family, going to see it. You can't really replicate that experience of something on the big screen with the sound system in your home. I mean, they tried to do that with Milan last year and they were charging, I think, $50 to watch it on Disney+. And I just looked at that and I said, you know what, there is no way in hell I'm going to pay that to watch it in my home. But there's every chance I would actually pay that exact same amount of price to, get a large popcorn and take the partner out and just have a day of it. So very different experience. You're 100% right. Today is obviously a day which we're looking at as, for most of New South Wales, it's a time to get back out there. It's opening back up. Is there a bit of nerves for you in relation to that? How does today look for Majestic Cinemas?
Well, we're a bit different. In actual fact, people are talking about Freedom Day, and for those cinemas in Sydney and in the next few weeks in Melbourne as well, as they start to open up, that's a huge day. For us, all of our cinemas, apart from the odd week-long lockdown that we might have had, whether it's in Brisbane or Port Macquarie or Kempsey in various places over the last few months, we've largely been open through this period since mid-September. We were closed down, of course, as the whole state was before that. So we've always been open, generally. So today's a bit bittersweet for us. We actually, in many of our regional areas, start to go backwards because previously we could accept anyone as a customer. We're at 75% of normal capacity. Whereas as of today, we're still at 75% of capacity, but only people who are double vaccinated can actually attend the cinema. So we've got a period of time for the next, say, 7 weeks before things get back to some sort of normality, where we're actually gone backwards a bit. So everyone, in a sense, is talking about Freedom Day, and for those in Sydney and other areas that have been in long-term lockdown, the Hunter Valley, we have a cinema in the Hunter Valley, but it has been open for the last 4 or so weeks. It's great for them because they can finally open with 75% capacity. For us, we actually have a little bit of a challenge. So the nervousness for us is not about being open again. It's about how we manage those issues about vaccinations with our customers.
Absolutely. Now, you made mention of some of these big movies that have already been delayed. We know that the new James Bond is out. Everybody's loving it. There's been rave reviews over in the UK, for example. What would be some of your key recommendations about what's on screen right now as we get back into life, and also what's coming in the next month or two?
If people are in Sydney and in Melbourne as it opens up, 2 big movies that they've missed there that we have been able to show in our cinemas, luckily, which have been huge, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which is the latest Marvel movie, which is a sort of an Asian martial arts focus, but look past that, it's a classic Marvel movie. And also one called Free Guy from Disney with Ryan Reynolds, which is great fun. And in fact, you were talking about the big screen experience. Had some people who watched it on Disney Plus. I think it's now been released on Disney Plus, who went, "Oh, it was a bit ho-hum." But watching it on the big screen is a whole different experience. So certainly one that, if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's worth seeing on the big screen. Over the next few weeks, we don't have a lot releasing, and that's in the US. There are huge releases going on at the moment, but we've been delayed a bit in Australia. So Bond is in Australia on November the 11th. Whereas it's released overseas in the last week or so. So we got delayed, and we're the latest country in the world to show it, unfortunately, but it will come in about a month's time. The other ones to look out for over the next while, there's another big Marvel movie called The Eternals, with Salma Hayek and Angelina Jolie and a whole range of Game of Thrones stars in it, which is a sort of a new franchise or part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as they call it. We've also got one of I'm looking forward to the most that's starting to release around the world now is Dune, which is the, as in D-U-N-E, which is the Frank Herbert novel, which I've just reread, the classic sci-fi novel. That's apparently fantastic, particularly on the big screen. All these movies run for about 3 hours too, so you get your money's worth. And then there's some other sort of good little movies, or littler movies in terms of the kids, one called Ron's Gone Wrong from Disney. An animated one. We've got another Disney animation coming up in early December called Encanto, and there's a whole range of other great movies. The other one is Venom 2, the sequel to the original Venom a couple of years ago with Tom Hardy, which is a Marvel-type movie, Spider-Man spin-off. It was very successful a few years ago, and this one opened to $90 million in the US alone last week. So wow. That comes to us at the end of November. So we've got a huge range of movies, and then as we get into Christmas, everything from West Side Story to the Sing 2, the sequel to Sing a few years back, and a new Spider-Man movie in the middle of December as well. And then there's the new Matrix movie, Ghostbusters Afterlife, the reboot of Ghostbusters, The Kingsman, which is the prequel to Kingsman. So some really big movies over the next few months for people to look forward to.
It is looking like quite a bright future. Kieren, just before I let you go, speaking of the future, what does the future of cinema look like to you?
It looks a little bit different. It's changed with COVID. I think we will have a more diverse programming. Some of the alternate content I talked about, we might find us using the big screen to play video games, or to have live concerts and streaming that, or to have premieres of movies with Q&As via technology. As we've all become better at using Zoom and those sort of technologies, I think we'll see that incorporated into the cinema experience a lot more. We are going to see a lot of blockbusters over the next 12 to 18 months. The ones that are already locked in are huge. And I think we will see people come for the events, and I think we will see that older demographic start to drift back, particularly with James Bond and a few other movies that appeal to them. They'll start to come back as well. So I think we'll get back to business as usual pretty much from Christmas, but we will see those shorter windows before things go to streaming. We might see shorter seasons and things, a lot more variety of content. But the funny thing about those windows decreasing is that we might find that some of those middle-sized movies, when the studios are allowed to put them out onto home video a little bit earlier and onto the streaming platforms, that we might actually see more of a choice at cinemas than we've had in the last little while. So we might see more content. So I think we'll see a change in the content. I think we'll see a lot more upgrading of cinemas. So in Brisbane, where we built our new cinema, the opening in March, we have 2 premium cinemas with reclining seats and the food and beverage solution. They've been big in the cities. We might start to see those branch out from the cities a little bit more, because it is about the experience. And if you can come and be in a recliner seat and be served some food and some alcohol, people are prepared to pay a little bit more for that in a lot of areas. Perhaps not a lot of the regional areas as yet, but it is starting to see an improve in that experience. So we will see changes over the next while.
Look, there's nothing quite like feeling like a VIP, that's for sure. Kieren, thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully we can chat again quite soon.
We will. Thanks. Thank you, James.
Well, that's Kieren Dell, CEO of Majestic Cinemas, and if you missed any part of that interview, you can catch the full thing on our YouTube channel, Kalkine Media, along with our extensive catalogue of expert talks. That's all for this edition of Executive Corner Expert Talks, though. I'm James Preston, signing off for now.